What if the most effective support system for your body has been sitting in your kitchen this whole time and nobody told you how to actually use it? Not as a flavoring, not as a garnish. As a functional biological toolkit that manages blood sugar, inflammation, cognition, and stress through compounds your body already knows how to process. We've spent generations outsourcing that function to synthetic pills, and the clinical evidence is now catching up to what traditional systems figured out centuries ago. These 20 plants are what we're going through today, one by one, with the mechanisms behind each of them. Number 1, ashwagandha. Most people dealing with chronic stress walk out of a doctor's office with something that blunts their entire nervous system. What they actually needed was something that works on cortisol, the hormone driving the physical damage of stress. Ayurvedic practitioners figured that out over 3,000 years ago with Withania somnifera, ashwagandha. The skepticism about whether adaptogens do anything measurable is fair. So let's look at what the data shows. Ashwagandha contains withanides that interact with your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the control loop regulating cortisol output. When that loop stays activated too long, blood pressure climbs, sleep breaks down, and immune function drops. The withanides modulate that feedback loop rather than shutting it off entirely. Clinical trials have measured real reductions in serum cortisol in people taking standardized ashwagandha extract. That's regulation, not sedation, and that distinction matters. Most synthetic anxiolytics suppress neural activity broadly. This plant works upstream on the hormonal signal itself, which is a completely different approach. From a practical standpoint, the root powder goes into warm milk or a smoothie, and standardized extracts give you a consistent dose if you want that. The realistic timeline is weeks, not days, because what you're building is a more stable baseline for how your system responds to stress. Number 2, turmeric. Turmeric, curcuma longa, has been in South Asian cooking for centuries, and nobody was thinking about bioavailability when they added it to a curry. Then modern research found a problem. Curcumin, the active polyphenol in turmeric, is poorly absorbed by the gut on its own. That discovery nearly buried turmeric's credibility as a functional plant. Then researchers looked at what traditional cooking had been doing the whole time. Black pepper. Piperine, the compound that gives black pepper its bite, blocks the enzymes that break curcumin down before it reaches your bloodstream, and the absorption difference is dramatic enough to move curcumin from a trace amount to a dose that actually does something. What curcumin does is work on NF-κB, a transcription factor that switches on the genes producing inflammatory proteins, so it's hitting the signaling mechanism behind joint degradation, cardiovascular stress, and neurological decline. Curcumin's also fat-soluble, so cooking it in oil helps too. Traditional cuisine figured out both pairings long before any lab confirmed why they worked. Number 3, ginger. Nausea drugs tend to work on the brain, which is why they make you drowsy or foggy. Zingiber officinale, ginger, takes a completely different approach. It works in the gut itself, on the receptors that control the vomiting reflex before the signal even travels upward. Fresh ginger contains gingerols, and dried ginger converts those into shogaols. Both forms interact with 5-HT3 receptors in the gastrointestinal tract, which are the exact same receptors that pharmaceutical antiemetics target. Clinical trials have confirmed genuine efficacy for morning sickness, chemotherapy-induced nausea, and motion sickness, so the mechanism isn't folk medicine dressed up in modern language. Beyond nausea, ginger accelerates gastric emptying, meaning food clears the stomach faster and bloating drops without any antacid required. About half a teaspoon of ground ginger, or roughly an inch of fresh ginger grated into hot water, gives you a working dose for either application. Number 4, holy basil. Tulsi, Ocimum tenuiflorum, gets classified as an adaptogen, but it works across a wider set of pathways than ashwagandha does. Where ashwagandha focuses tightly on cortisol, Tulsi also touches blood sugar regulation, immune response, and the nervous system at the same time. That breadth is actually the point, because your body's stress response isn't a single pathway you can fix with one targeted compound. The active compounds, eugenol, rosmarinic acid, and osamumicides, have shown cortisol-lowering activity in both animal and human studies. Chronically elevated cortisol drives insulin resistance, so Tulsi's effect on stress hormones also stabilizes blood glucose, which is addressing the driver rather than the downstream symptom. That same cortisol reduction is what supports immune function, because high cortisol suppresses it. So the cup of Tulsi tea you're drinking for anxiety is also lifting the hormonal suppression that was weakening your immune response at the same time. Number 5. Chamomile. Matricaria chamomilla is so common that most people stopped taking it seriously somewhere around the time it showed up in the grocery store checkout aisle. But it ended up there because it actually works, and the mechanism is specific enough that pharmaceutical researchers spent years trying to isolate and patent the active compound. That compound is apigenin, a flavonoid that binds to GABA-A receptors in the brain, which are the exact same receptors that benzodiazepines target. The difference is that apigenin binds with much lower affinity, so you get a calming effect without the dependency, rebound anxiety, or cognitive fog that comes with pharmaceutical GABA agonists. Clinical trials have shown reductions in anxiety scores and better sleep quality, particularly in older adults. From a practical standpoint, steeping your chamomile for a full 10 minutes instead of the usual 3 to 5 extracts significantly more apigenin. Pharmaceutical companies couldn't patent apigenin, so chamomile stayed in the tea aisle. Number 6. Peppermint. IBS affects a lot of adults, and the pharmaceutical options for managing it range from mildly effective to hard to tolerate. Mentha X piperita has been in clinical trials for IBS for decades, and the results landed it in actual gastroenterology guidelines. The active compound is menthol, and it works by blocking calcium channels in the smooth muscle cells lining your intestinal wall. Calcium influx triggers muscle contraction, so blocking it relaxes the gut and directly addresses the cramping that drives IBS pain. Menthol also has a mild analgesic effect on visceral pain receptors, so it's reducing both the spasm and your perception of the pain at the same time. Enteric-coated capsules are what the trials used because you need the menthol to reach your intestines, not dissolve in your stomach. Peppermint tea works fine for general bloating after meals, but if you have reflux, skip it entirely, because that same muscle-relaxing effect loosens the esophageal sphincter and makes reflux worse. Number 7. Echinacea. The debate around echinacea usually comes from people comparing studies that use different species, different plant parts, and different preparations, then concluding the evidence is mixed. That's not a fair read of the data. When you control for those variables, the picture gets much cleaner. There are 3 main species used medicinally: Echinacea purpurea, Echinacea angustifolia, and Echinacea pallida. They don't share the same chemical profile, so using them interchangeably is like saying aspirin and ibuprofen are identical because they both come in white tablets. E. purpurea aerial parts have the strongest evidence for cutting the duration and severity of upper respiratory infections. The alkylamides and polysaccharides in it stimulate macrophage activity and push up interferon production, which is your body's primary antiviral signal. That's a specific upregulation of innate immune function, not a vague boost. Timing matters too. Echinacea works at the first sign of symptoms, not as a daily year-round supplement, because constant use causes the receptors to downregulate. Number 8. Milk thistle. Most people don't think about their liver until something goes wrong, and by then, the damage has been building for years. Silybum marianum, milk thistle, has been used in European herbal medicine for liver conditions for over 2,000 years, and the clinical evidence behind it is some of the most specific in botanical medicine. The active compound is silymarin, a group of flavonolignanes pulled from the seeds. What makes it unusual is that it works through multiple protective mechanisms at once. It stabilizes hepatocyte cell membranes, so toxins have a harder time getting into liver cells in the first place. It also pushes protein synthesis in liver cells, which speeds tissue repair, and it neutralizes free radicals generated during detoxification reactions. 3 separate protective actions from one compound. Clinical trials have shown improvements in liver enzyme levels across alcoholic liver disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and drug-induced liver injury. Your liver does the regenerating. Silymarin just gives it better conditions to work in. Number 9. Dandelion. We spend money on herbicides to kill Taraxacum officinale, a plant our great-grandparents would have grown on purpose because it was too useful to leave to chance. Both the leaf and the root are medicinally distinct, and they don't overlap much. The leaf works as a natural diuretic, but unlike pharmaceutical loop diuretics such as furosemide, it replenishes potassium while promoting fluid excretion because the leaf itself is high in potassium. That's a real difference because furosemide depletes potassium and requires separate supplementation to compensate. The root does something else entirely. It feeds beneficial gut bacteria through its inulin content, stimulates bile production to support fat digestion, and carries anti-inflammatory activity in its sesquiterpene lactones, the same compounds responsible for its bitter taste. Young leaves go into salads, the roasted root substitutes for coffee, and either part makes a working tea. Don't try to remove the bitterness. That's where the medicine lives. Number 10. Lavender. Aromatherapy as a category has a credibility problem, and that's fair, because most of it gets marketed without any mechanistic basis. Lavandula angustifolia is different, and the distinction matters if you're trying to separate what actually works from what's just pleasant. The two primary volatile compounds in lavender oil, linalool and linaloyl acetate, absorb through the olfactory system and through skin. Once in circulation, linalool shows activity at GABA-A receptors, which handle inhibitory signaling in the brain, and at glutamate receptors, which drive excitatory signaling. That's a measurable neurochemical interaction, not a mood response to a nice smell. A pharmaceutical preparation called Silexan has been through randomized controlled trials for generalized anxiety disorder and performed comparably to low-dose benzodiazepines without the dependency risk. For acute anxiety, inhaling directly from the bottle for 30 seconds to a minute works faster than waiting for a diffuser to fill a room. Your nervous system has receptors that respond to airborne plant compounds. That's chemistry. Number 11, rosemary. Salvia rosmarinus has been linked to memory in European folk tradition for centuries. Shakespeare even put it in Hamlet. While the lore is poetic, the neuroscience behind it is actually more direct than most people expect. Most plant compounds don't cross the blood-brain barrier, the selective filter protecting neural tissue. Two of rosemary's primary actives, rosmarinic acid and 1,8-cineol, do cross it, which is why rosemary produces neurological effects at all. 1,8-cineol inhibits acetylcholinesterase, the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine in synaptic junctions. Acetylcholine drives memory formation and recall, and pharmaceutical Alzheimer's drugs like donepezil work through this exact same mechanism. Rosemary does it at culinary concentrations. Studies on rosemary aroma show measurable improvements in memory speed and accuracy, with blood levels of 1,8-cineol correlating directly to performance scores. Rosmarinic acid also protects neural tissue from oxidative damage, so rosemary works on both the immediate neurotransmitter side and the slower inflammatory side of cognitive aging. Number 12. Sage. Salvia officinalis shares chemistry with rosemary because they're in the same botanical family. But sage has its own clinical story, and it goes further. The acetylcholinesterase research didn't stop at healthy subjects. It's been tested in people with mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease, and daily sage extract over 4 months produced measurable improvements in cognitive function scores compared to placebo. What makes that result hard to replicate with a single pharmaceutical compound is that multiple compounds in sage work on acetylcholinesterase together. And sage also touches serotonin and dopamine pathways, which broadens its effect on both mood and memory. Rosmarinic acid, carnosic acid, and a range of terpenoids protect existing neurons from oxidative damage at the same time. So you're getting two approaches to cognitive aging running in parallel. Fresh sage crisped in butter, sage tea, or the diffused essential oil all work. Most people pull it out once a year at Thanksgiving. Number 13. Lemon balm. Melissa officinalis is easy to grow and easy to ignore, which is a problem because its pharmacological profile does something that most calming plants can't. It reduces anxiety without dulling your thinking. Most calming compounds work by broadly suppressing neural activity, which is why sedatives leave you foggy. Lemon balm works differently. Rosmarinic acid, its primary active compound, inhibits the enzyme that breaks down GABA in the brain, so GABA levels rise and excitatory firing drops. Less neural noise, less anxiety. But lemon balm also modulates acetylcholine levels, which supports memory and attention, so the net effect is a calmer but sharper mental state. Clinical trials have confirmed reductions in anxiety and mood improvements in stressed adults, and separate studies showed better attention speed and memory in both younger and older subjects. Most sedatives trade one problem for another. Lemon balm doesn't make that trade. Number 14, nettle. Most people's first experience with Urtica dioica involved bare legs and a hiking trail, and that memory sticks. The sting is real. But blanch the leaves for 30 seconds and the sting is completely gone, and what you're left with is one of the most nutritionally complete plants in the temperate world. The compounds behind that sting, including histamine and formic acid, actually shift function once the plant gets processed. Dried or cooked nettle contains UDA, a lectin that modulates T-cell and B-cell activity and inhibits NF-κB, the same inflammatory transcription factor that curcumin targets. Clinical trials on rheumatoid arthritis showed patients cutting their NSAID doses roughly in half while keeping the same pain control. On the nutritional side, nettle carries more iron per gram than most meat, plus calcium, magnesium, and vitamins A, C, and K. After blanching, it cooks exactly like spinach, so soups, pasta, and side dishes all work. Number 15, aloe vera. Aloe barbadensis Miller sits on more windowsills than almost any other plant, and most people have no idea what it actually contains. The topical use for burns is well established, but the internal use is a different story, and it starts with knowing that the gel and the latex in the same leaf are chemically distinct. The latex, sitting just under the outer skin, contains anthraquinones, including aloin, which are powerful laxatives that cause real problems with overuse. The gel is what you want. It contains icamanin, a polysaccharide that stimulates fibroblast activity and collagen synthesis, which are the two processes that drive tissue repair. That same icamanin also activates macrophages, supporting immune response through the same pathway we saw with Echinacea's polysaccharides. For internal use, look specifically for products labeled decolorized and purified, meaning the aloin has been removed. That label distinction isn't minor. A fresh leaf from your own plant gives you clean gel with no processing concerns at all. Number 16, ginseng. Panax ginseng has one of the longest continuous records of human use of any plant we're covering today, and the modern clinical literature on it is large enough that we can be specific about what it actually does. First, sort out the naming confusion. Panax ginseng, Panax quinquefolius, and Eleutherococcus senticosus are three different plants with different chemistry. Most of the strongest clinical data sits specifically on Panax ginseng, so that's what we're talking about. The active compounds are ginsenosides, steroidal saponins that modulate glucocorticoid receptors, estrogen receptors, and nitric oxide pathways. They don't stimulate those systems directly, they regulate them, which is why ginseng earns the adaptogen classification. Clinical trials show improvements in mental performance, reaction time, and working memory in healthy adults, and separate trials show it helps manage treatment fatigue in cancer patients. When buying it, standardized extracts specifying ginsenoside content matter far more than the total weight of the root powder. Number 17, calendula. Calendula officinalis has been used for wound care since at least the 12th century. Medieval physicians cleaned wounds with it. Civil War field surgeons packed it into dressings when supplies ran short. Modern clinical trials have proven what those practitioners knew through observation. The reason it got overlooked in the 20th century is simple. Pharmaceutical companies can't patent a flower. The flowers are packed with flavonoids, triterpenoids, and polysaccharides that have genuine anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties. The triterpenoids stimulate granulation tissue formation, which is the first stage of wound healing, while the flavonoids reduce the inflammatory response that, when it runs too hot, actually slows healing down. Clinical trials comparing calendula to standard treatments for post-surgical wounds and radiation dermatitis show it performing comparably or better. Steep dried flower heads in a carrier oil for a few weeks and you've got the traditional preparation. Think of it as the emergency room in your backyard. Number 18, moringa. The supplement industry sells you iron in one bottle, vitamin A in another, and protein powder in a third. Moringa oleifera makes that whole model look inefficient. Dried moringa leaf carries a complete amino acid profile, more iron per gram than most plant sources, and solid amounts of calcium, potassium, and vitamin A, all in one ingredient. It also contains quercetin and chlorogenic acid, two polyphenols that work on blood sugar regulation through the same glucose absorption pathways that some pharmaceutical diabetes drugs target. Clinical trials on moringa leaf powder have shown reductions in fasting blood glucose and better lipid profiles in people with type 2 diabetes. The isothiocyanates in moringa also inhibit NF-κB, the same inflammatory pathway we've seen targeted by curcumin and nettle. A teaspoon of dried moringa powder in a smoothie or soup covers that whole range at once. 5 separate supplements won't tell you that. Number 19. Fennel. Feniculum vulgare sits in most kitchens as a spice, not a medicine, but the seeds contain anethole, a compound structurally similar to estrogen. That sounds alarming until you understand what it actually does. Anethole is a phytoestrogen, so it interacts with estrogen receptors at much lower binding strength than your body's own estrogen, which means it can produce mild estrogenic effects without the risks of pharmaceutical hormone replacement. Clinical trials comparing fennel seed extract to a standard pharmaceutical NSAID for menstrual cramps found fennel performed comparably for pain reduction. The mechanism runs on 2 tracks: anethole's estrogenic activity and its antispasmodic effect on smooth muscle, directly addressing the uterine contractions driving the pain. That antispasmodic effect also works in your gut, reducing gas and bloating by relaxing intestinal smooth muscle. For digestive use, chew a small amount of fennel seeds after meals or steep lightly crushed seeds as tea. Number 20, yarrow. Achillea millefolium is named after Achilles, who supposedly used it on wounded soldiers. That's a legend, but the underlying claim has been validated by modern chemistry in a way that makes the story feel less like mythology and more like documented field medicine. The plant does 2 things that seem like they'd cancel each other out. It promotes clotting and reduces inflammation at the same time. Alkaline and related alkaloids push platelet aggregation and tighten blood vessels at wound sites, stopping bleeding. Separately, flavonoids and sesquiterpene lactones in the plant block inflammatory prostaglandin synthesis, so the tissue around the wound stays calm while it heals. Beyond wound care, yarrow stimulates bile production and digestive enzyme secretion, making it useful for sluggish digestion. It also promotes sweating, which traditional medicine used for fever support. Yarrow tea covers the internal applications. Fresh leaves pressed directly onto minor cuts is the first aid use soldiers relied on.